Who last the longest in the hardest job in Britain, long enough for the wallpaper at number 10 to fade, for colleagues to become enemies, for enemies to become footnotes, and for whole generations to grow up thinking one face simply belongs behind that famous black door, and who barely had time to find the light switches. Prime ministers who arrived, blinked at the red boxes and were already on their way out again. Tonight, we're ranking every British Prime Minister by how long they lasted, longest to shortest, listening for the patterns that keep a leader afloat and the quiet traps that drag them under. This isn't just trivia, it's a slow, human study of power and endurance, wars that freeze politics in place, parties that devour their own, illnesses hidden behind stiff collars, and the strange way stability can mean anything from prosperity to simply surviving the week. If you like long, detail-rich British history for sleep or background listening, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Rank 1. Sir Robert Walpole, 20 years, 314 days. If longevity were a crown, Robert Walpole would wear it with the bored ease of someone who forgets it's on his head. Walpole's time in power stretches across 2 decades in the early 18th century when the office of Prime Minister was still half-formed, more practice than statute, more habit than job description. And that's part of the trick. He didn't inherit a fully lit stage. He helped build the stage, arrange the curtains, and decide where the audience should look. He lasted because he mastered the unglamorous mechanic, managing Parliament, steering patronage, soothing the monarchy, and turning politics into something you could operate like a machine. There were scandals and enemies, there are always enemies, but Walpole's genius was making survival feel like administration. In a modern sense, he's a reminder that long-serving doesn't always mean beloved. Sometimes it means unavoidable. And speaking of unavoidable, our next figure is another specialist in outlasting storms, but with far more thunder in his era's skies. Rank 2. William Pitt, the younger, 18 years, 343 days. William Pitt the younger doesn't just last a long time, he lasts across a turning of the world. His combined tenure is vast, spread over 2 separate periods, and it's hard to overstate the pressure under which those years sit. Britain's wars with revolutionary France, and then Napoleonic France, with political fear and financial strain seeping into daily government, like damp into old plaster. Pitt became Prime Minister astonishingly young, and his survival owed a great deal to the fact that he could look like what the country wanted, serious, dutiful, steady, while steering through a crisis with a kind of austere competence. You can almost feel how national emergencies freeze political motion. When the ship is in heavy seas, many people cling to the nearest proven hand on the wheel. But Pitt's length is also a warning. Long tenure can drain a person. His final exit is not a triumphant retirement. He dies in office, worn down in the very years that made his reputation. And now, from war to another kind of long grind, an era of post-war conservatism, caution, and the slow ache of governing after victory. Rank 3, the Earl of Liverpool, 14 years, 305 days. Lord Liverpool's longevity is quieter than Pitt's, less fire, more endurance. His long, single stretch in office begins in 1812, with Britain still locked in conflict, and continues into the difficult aftermath, a nation trying to exhale after years of war, only to find that peace brings its own unrest, economic hardship, political agitation, and the growing pressure for reform. Liverpool lasts because he becomes, in effect, a manager of prolonged strain. He presides over a government wary of change, sometimes brutally so, in an age when protest could be treated less like speech and more like threat. His was not an easy popularity contest, it was a balancing act. Keep order, keep Parliament together, keep the state functioning. He eventually leaves due to illness, another recurring theme in these rankings. Power is not only fought over, it is also physically survived. Next, we step into the later Victorian world, where longevity can be built not just on crisis, but on party dominance, careful timing, and the slow art of stepping aside before you're pushed. Rank 4. The Marquess of Salisbury, 13 years, 252 days. Salisbury's total is the sum of 3 premierships, proof that the long game in British politics is sometimes literal: leave, return, and rule again. He operates in the late 19th century with a patrician confidence, a kind of cold clarity about what the Conservative Party is and what it must do to keep power. His longevity is less about one unstoppable wave and more about catching the right tide, resigning, coming back and using electoral outcomes as opportunities rather than verdicts. Salisbury's years also remind us that the premiership can be shaped by what happens beyond Britain's shores. Empire is not background scenery here. It is a constant pressure, a supply line of prestige and trouble, and a source of both political confidence and political risk. He ends with illness, stepping away as health collapses. Again, the body calling time. And then we come to a man whose very career looks like a revolving door, yet somehow adds up to an extraordinary total. Rank 5, William Ewart Gladstone, 12 years, 126 days. Gladstone is what happens when a country can't stop arguing with itself, so it keeps calling back the same voice, hoping this time it will resolve the debate rather than deepen it. 4 separate terms, 4 returns to the top, and a total long enough to rank among the greatest, even though no single stretch quite matches the giants above him. Gladstone's longevity comes from moral force and political stamina. He is a reformer, a relentless worker, a man who can make policy feel like conscience. But it also comes from division. On Ireland, on empire, on the shape of liberalism itself, Gladstone becomes a focal point, and when the centre cannot hold, old leaders can be summoned like familiar tools. His repeated exits matter as much as his entries. He is defeated. He resigns. He returns. He resigns again. Long tenure, in his case, is not smooth authority. It's a series of hard landings and fresh takeoffs. Now, if Gladstone is the returning storm, the next Prime Minister is the long siege, a government that becomes synonymous with one disastrous conflict across an ocean. Rank 6, Lord North, 12 years, 58 days. Lord North's long tenure contains a kind of slow tragedy. The longer he serves, the more he becomes tied to a war that Britain ultimately cannot win. His years as Prime Minister stretch through the American War of Independence, and longevity here doesn't mean triumph. It can mean being the person in the room while events curdle, while policies harden into stubbornness, while compromise becomes politically poisonous, while the public mood sours. North is often described as personally affable, even humorous, but the premiership is not a personality contest. It is a consequence engine, and his consequences are heavy. Yet he lasts as long as he does because government in wartime becomes adhesive. Parties hesitate to break apart when the state is under strain. Leadership changes look like weakness, and weakness looks like defeat. So the same man stays even as the ground shifts beneath him. And speaking of leaders who become inseparable from a national mood, next comes the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, whose years are measured not just in days, but in reshaped institutions and transformed political language. Rank 7. Margaret Thatcher, 11 years, 208 days. Thatcher's longevity is sharp-edged. It lasts because it cuts. Her single uninterrupted stretch from 1979 to 1990 makes her the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, and it's difficult to separate time served from impact delivered. She doesn't simply occupy the premiership. She redefines what it sounds like, what it demands, what it refuses. She lasts through electoral victories and through conflict, industrial, political, and sometimes almost personal. She also lasts because she understands the power of clarity. Even her enemies know what she believes, and even her supporters know what she expects. In politics, that kind of certainty can function like gravity, but longevity has a cost. The same rigidity that keeps you in place can also make you brittle. Thatcher's end comes not from the electorate, but from her own party, proof that prime ministers are often removed not by the public directly, but by the people who once needed them most. And now we drift back into the 18th century again. to a Prime Minister whose long tenure ends the way so many do in these rankings, with death, the most final form of resignation. Rank 8. Henry Pelham. 10 years, 191 days. Henry Pelham's decade in power is an example of the kind of longevity that doesn't scream, but steadily settles. In an era when Britain's political world runs on aristocratic networks, patronage, and carefully maintained alliances, Pelham's endurance suggests not flamboyance, but competence, an ability to keep the system lubricated, to prevent factions from grinding the government to pieces. He serves in the middle of the 18th century, when the modern party system is still developing, and the lines between statesman and operator are thin and constantly crossed. If you want to understand why early British government could look stable on the surface while being frantic underneath, Pelham is a useful guide. Stability isn't always the absence of conflict. Sometimes it's the successful management of it. His premiership ends with his death. No dramatic coup, no electoral verdict, just the quiet fact that a human body can only bear so many years of the job. And now, leaping forward into modern media politics, we meet a Prime Minister whose decade is framed by war abroad and sweeping domestic change, yet whose final exit is, again, a chosen step down rather than an electoral defeat. Rank 9. Tony Blair. 10 years, 56 days. Tony Blair's tenure is long enough to feel like an era, and for many people it was. He comes in with the force of electoral transformation, New Labour, a rebranded centre, the promise of competence with optimism, and he holds on through 3 election victories. That alone tells you something about longevity. It often belongs to those who can repeatedly make themselves feel like the safest option, even when the country is restless. His years include significant constitutional changes, devolution, reforming the House of Lords, the Good Friday Agreement's political context, and also the defining shadow of foreign policy decisions in the post-9/11 world. The longer Blair stays, the more his legacy narrows in popular memory until one subject begins to drown out the rest, and he leaves by resignation, not defeat. That can be framed as control or as inevitability, because even long-serving leaders can reach a point where staying becomes the more dangerous move. Next, we return to the 19th century to a Prime Minister who dies in office and whose tenure is stitched together across 2 separate runs, like a careful seam drawn through the fabric of Victorian politics. Rank 10. The Viscount Palmerston. 9 years, 141 days. Palmerston's longevity has an unusual flavour. It feels both institutional and intensely personal. He serves in 2 stints, and in both he radiates a kind of combative confidence, an assertive approach to foreign policy, a readiness to project British power, and an ability to remain politically viable in a fast-changing age. Victorian Britain is expanding, industrialising, arguing with itself about reform, and Palmerston somehow feels like he belongs to all of it. His endurance also reflects something you'll see again and again. Prime Ministers can survive when they embody a national story people want to believe. In Palmerston's case, it's the story of Britain as a force to be reckoned with, energetic, unembarrassed, slightly swaggering. He dies in office, which gives his tenure a closed, almost cinematic ending, and death in politics can sometimes freeze a reputation in a way resignation never does. Now, we enter the 20th century's first great political rupture, the years when the old liberal order strains under war, and a long tenure ends not with election defeat, but with internal collapse. Rank 11. H. Asquith. 8 years, 244 days. Asquith lasts long enough to govern in peacetime, and then long enough to be consumed by war. His tenure covers the years before and during the First World War, years of reform, constitutional conflict, and then the sudden violence of a global catastrophe that rewrites the job description while you're still holding the post. In calmer conditions, Asquith's style, intellectual, measured, lawyerly, can look like authority. In total war, the same style can be reframed as hesitation, and that is one of the cruelest dynamics of longevity. You can be the right leader for one chapter, and the wrong leader for the next, without changing as a person at all. He falls not to the electorate directly, but to shifting coalitions and internal party fracture. The premiership, especially in crisis, is often decided by who can hold together the people who vote inside the system, not just outside it. Next comes a name that feels carved into the very idea of wartime leadership, yet even he, iconic as he is, ranks only 11th by total time. Longevity and legend don't always match. Rank 12, Sir Winston Churchill, 8 years, 239 days. Churchill's total is split across 2 premierships, the desperate years of the Second World War and the later return in the early 1950s. His longevity isn't about uninterrupted control. It's about the ability to be twice the answer to different national questions. In 1940, the question is survival. In 1951, the question is reassurance, an older, familiar figure promising steadiness in a new world. But Churchill's position in this ranking is quietly instructive. The most mythologized prime minister in modern British memory is not among the top 10 by tenure. The country's gratitude doesn't automatically translate into keeping you in office. In fact, his 1945 election defeat is one of the stark reminders that the British electorate can admire a leader and still decide they want someone else to build the peace. His final exit comes due to illness. Again, the body interrupting history. And speaking of leaders who come and go with the electorate's moods, our next Prime Minister is a master of returning, a figure who bookends the 1960s and mid-1970s, and whose total adds up through 2 distinct political climates. Rank 13, Harold Wilson, 7 years, 279 days. Harold Wilson's longevity is made of 2 very different Britons. He first enters office in the 1960s with a promise of modernization, white heat of technology, a managed sense of progress, and the careful politics of social change. Then he returns in 1974 into a country that feels exhausted. Industrial conflict, economic instability, and the sense that the post-war consensus is starting to crack. Wilson survives because he is adaptable, in a way that doesn't always look glamorous. He can present himself as pragmatic rather than visionary, and in the hard years, pragmatism can be a lifeboat. He can also handle party management, one of the most underestimated survival skills in this entire ranking. Governments rarely fall because the opposition is persuasive. They fall because their own side stops obeying. He resigns rather than losing an election, another echo in our story. Some prime ministers leave because they are thrown out. Others leave because they sense the throw coming. Next, we drift back again to the 18th century, where the premiership is still woven into court politics and aristocratic power, and where longevity can mean mastering a world of factions rather than parties. Rank 14, the Duke of Newcastle, 7 years, 205 days. Newcastle's total comes from 2 spells in office, and it carries the scent of the old political order. Great houses, patronage networks, and a government that can feel like an elaborate dinner party where everyone is armed. His longevity is often described as the triumph of political management rather than commanding charisma. He is deeply entangled in the machinery of parliamentary influence, able to pull strings, soothe egos, distribute favour. In the 18th century, that can keep you afloat longer than moral clarity or rhetorical brilliance. But Newcastle's career also shows a weakness of that system. When war and empire pressure the state, the old tools of influence can start to fail. The 7 Years' War era and its anxieties sharpen the question of competence. Still, the fact remains he lasts longer than many more famous names. Longevity sometimes belongs to those who can do the quiet, grubby work, day after day without being distracted by their own myth. And now we return to the 20th century, to a prime minister who served 3 times, whose name is a kind of shorthand for interwar conservatism, and whose total is built out of returns, each shaped by a different political emergency. Rank 15, Stanley Baldwin, 7 years, 82 days. Stanley Baldwin's longevity is a careful construction. 3 premierships, each one reflecting a moment when the Conservative Party and the broader establishment decide that calm is the most valuable commodity. He serves in the 1920s and 1930s, years haunted by the memory of war and by the fear of instability, economic, social, and ideological. Baldwin's style is often described as reassuring, measured, almost conversational. In politics, that tone can act like a sedative. It tells the country nothing is spinning out of control, even when it is. His time intersects with deep national strains, industrial unrest, the general strike, the churn of interwar economics, and he becomes part of the story of how Britain manages, or fails to manage, the approach of the next catastrophe. Baldwin eventually resigns, and his reputation becomes heavily contested later, especially in hindsight about rearmament and the 1930s. Longevity can give you a lot of time to shape events. It also gives history a lot of material to accuse you with. And speaking of leaders whose reputations are argued over in the long aftertaste of their time, next comes a Victorian name with a surprisingly high total, built not from one long reign, but from 2 sharp returns in a turbulent era. Rank 16. Benjamin Disraeli, 6 years, 339 days. Disraeli's total is built from 2 terms, and it carries that distinctive Victorian electricity. Ambition dressed as theatre, policy delivered with a sense of performance, and a career that always seems aware of the audience beyond the chamber. His first spell is short, almost like a trial run. He reaches the top, takes the measure of the room, and is swiftly replaced by the electorate. But his second term lasts long enough to feel like a proper reign of style and direction, years in which conservatism tries to become something broader than an old club for old certainty. Longevity, in Disraeli's case, comes from narrative control. He doesn't just offer government, he offers meaning. He presents the party as the guardian of a national story, monarchy, empire, identity, while also accepting that the franchise is widening and politics is becoming more public, more emotional, more modern. And yet, for all the flourish, he cannot outlast the swing of public mood. His longer term ends in electoral defeat, which is one of the recurring lessons of this ranking. Even when you make politics feel like destiny, the calendar still belongs to voters. And speaking of leaders who tried to govern through changing social weather, next comes a man whose career is practically a diagram of interwar upheaval. Rank 17. Ramsay MacDonald, 6 years, 289 days. Ramsay MacDonald's tenure is stitched together from 2 periods, and the seam between them is one of the most controversial in modern British political memory. His first government is brief and historic, a Labour Prime Minister in an era when many still treat Labour as an interruption rather than a possible permanent force. That first spell ends quickly, but the point has been made. The old 2-party rhythm is changing. His second, longer premiership begins in 1929 and then collides with the Great Depression. And this is where longevity becomes complicated. The crisis is not merely economic. It is constitutional, moral, and political, because the choices made under pressure reshape what parties believe themselves to be. MacDonald's decision to lead a national government fractures Labour and permanently alters how many in the movement remember him. He stays in office for years after that break, but the endurance feels less like triumph and more like living inside of the storm you cannot fully steer. In the soft light of a sleep documentary, the details blur into a single impression. A leader lasts, but the lasting comes at a price so high it changes the meaning of his name. And speaking of leaders who lasted through national stress, next is a Conservative Prime Minister whose long tenure ends with illness, after years that look calm on the surface and anxious underneath. Rank 18. Harold Macmillan, 6 years, 281 days. Macmillan's years in office have that famous paradox, a sense of post-war confidence paired with the slow unravelling of empire and the creeping complications of modern scandal. He governs during a period remembered, sometimes too nostalgically, as an age of rising living standards and steady improvement. It's the era often summed up in a single line about how good people have it, a phrase that can sound like comfort or complacency depending on who's listening. Longevity for Macmillan comes from projecting competence. He looks like the embodiment of government in the old sense, composed, polished, and steeped in establishment confidence. But the world he governs is shifting fast, decolonization accelerating, global alignments changing, and domestic politics becoming more media-driven, less deferential. And then there is the quiet truth of this ranking. Many long-serving prime ministers do not fall to an election. They fall to their own bodies, or to the perception that they are weakening. Macmillan resigns due to illness, and that resignation feels like the end of a certain post-war tone. Next, we step back into the 19th century to a prime minister whose long run suggests how the office was already developing its modern rhythm: survive one defeat, return, and try again. Rank 19, the Viscount Melbourne, 6 years, 255 days. Melbourne's tenure is made of 2 pieces, and it's worth lingering on what that implies in his era. The monarchy is still a stronger presence in political life. Parties are looser, and the whole business of government can feel like a negotiation between court influence and parliamentary arithmetic. He is often remembered as a mentor figure, especially in relation to Queen Victoria, because his premiership sits inside that early Victorian moment when the monarchy is young, the public gaze is intense, and every interaction is freighted with symbolism. Longevity here isn't only about legislation. It's about stabilizing a relationship between Crown and Cabinet, smoothing sharp edges, preventing the machinery from clanking too loudly. But Melbourne's endurance also shows how quickly politics can pivot. He is pushed out, returns, and then eventually loses at the ballot box. Elections are becoming more decisive, more public, more like the modern mechanism we recognise. His years remind us the premiership used to be closer to a court appointment that could be maintained by careful handling. Over time, it becomes something more exposed, more dependent on voters and party discipline. And speaking of party discipline, next is a modern prime minister who inherits a party that has already been in power a long time and discovers how heavy that inheritance can be. Rank 20, John Major, 6 years, 155 days. John Major's tenure is long enough to be substantial, yet often remembered as if it happened in a permanent drizzle. Persistent, unglamorous, and difficult to photograph clearly. He arrives in office after a political titan. That alone shapes the way a premiership is perceived. You can be competent, diligent, even quietly effective, and still be compared to a shadow that fills the room. Major's longevity comes partly from steadiness, an ability to keep going day after day, even as the party begins to fracture. And fracture it does. The 1990s Conservative Party becomes a battleground, particularly over Europe, and the Prime Minister's job shifts from national leadership to internal containment. In these rankings, that is one of the most reliable predictors of a difficult tenure, when your own side turns the cabinet table into a trench. Major lasts through a full term and beyond, but his government becomes synonymous with exhaustion, sleaze scandals that erode credibility, and the feeling that time is running out. He leaves by electoral defeat, and the scale of that defeat makes his 6 years feel, in retrospect, like a long goodbye. And speaking of long goodbyes, next is a 19th century reformer whose total is built from 2 runs with a sharp, almost sudden return near the end of his political life. Rank 21. Lord John Russell, 6 years, 110 days. Lord John Russell's premiership spans 2 terms that sit on either side of major currents: reform, industrial unrest, the widening expectations of what government should do for people beyond the elite. His longer stint in the 1840s and early 1850s is marked by the hard realities of the era: social strain, political agitation, and the relentless question of who gets to count in the nation's decision-making. Russell's longevity comes partly from being a recognizable reforming figure, but also from operating in a political world where coalitions and factions can keep a leader afloat, even without overwhelming popular enthusiasm. Then comes the brief return in 1865, a late echo, almost a reminder that political careers can circle back unexpectedly. It's short, and it ends with resignation, suggesting a man whose moment has begun to pass, even if the system still reaches for him out of habit. Russell's total doesn't put him among the giants at the very top, but it is long enough to show something important. Reform often requires time, and time in office requires the ability to keep coalitions together even when the country is impatient. Next, we reach a Prime Minister whose tenure is only slightly shorter, yet whose impact on daily life is hard to exaggerate. Longevity isn't everything, but it certainly helps when you're rebuilding a country. Rank 22. Clement Attlee, 6 years, 92 days. Attlee's 6 years are not merely a premiership, they are a reconstruction. He governs after the Second World War when Britain is physically damaged, financially strained and socially exhausted, yet also full of a peculiar, bright determination. The war has demanded collective sacrifice, and Attlee's government turns that collective spirit into policy, the building of institutions meant to last longer than any single parliament. Longevity here comes from mandate. The electorate hands Labour power with a clarity that is almost shocking given Churchill's wartime status, and then Attlee's government uses the time to move fast, reshaping welfare, nationalising key industries, and founding structures that will define British political arguments for decades. Attlee's personal style is famously understated. In the context of this ranking, it's an instructive contrast. You don't need theatrical leadership to last. Sometimes you last by being credible, methodical, and surrounded by a team that knows what it wants to do. He eventually loses an election, and the post-war consensus begins its long two-party negotiation. And speaking of negotiation, next comes a modern Prime Minister who lasts through coalition, referendum, and resignation, discovering that longevity in the television age can be destroyed by a single vote. Rank 23, David Cameron, 6 years, 63 days. Cameron's tenure is long enough to cover a whole political chapter, yet it ends in a moment so sharp that it can make the years before it feel like prologue. He comes to power in 2010 without an outright majority, leading Britain's first peacetime coalition government in generations. That arrangement requires a particular kind of survival skill: compromise without looking compromised, firmness without breaking the partnership, and constant awareness that your allies may also be your rival. Cameron's years in office include economic austerity policies, social reforms, and a carefully curated image of modern conservatism. He appears for a time like a prime minister built for stability: calm tone, controlled presentation, managerial confidence. And then comes the referendum on European Union membership. In the story of prime ministerial longevity, this is one of those pivot points that rewrites everything. A single political gamble becomes an event with consequences so large it makes ordinary government look small. Cameron resigns after the result goes against him, and the office passes to someone tasked with navigating the aftermath. And speaking of aftermath, next is a Prime Minister whose tenure begins during the First World War and ends with a very different kind of conflict: political betrayal, coalition collapse, and the sense that power is never quite as secure as it looks. Rank 24. David Lloyd George, 5 years, 317 days. Lloyd George's premiership has the feeling of a man seizing the wheel mid-storm. He takes office in 1916 in the middle of the First World War, replacing a leader whose style is suddenly deemed insufficient for total conflict. This is one of the clearest patterns in the ranking. War can both elevate and consume. It can keep a leader in place because change looks risky, and it can also topple leaders who can't project urgency. Lloyd George lasts through the war and into peace, becoming the figure associated with victory and negotiation, yet also with the bitter complexities of settlement, promises, and the uneasy reality of rebuilding. His longevity is powered by coalition politics. Coalitions can make you strong because you draw from multiple camps. They can also make you fragile because your base is always partly borrowed. Lloyd George's government eventually collapses when that borrowed support is withdrawn, and his fall is swift once the coalition breaks. He resigns, and though his career continues, his return to the premiership never comes. And speaking of leaders who did return, next is a prime minister whose total is built from 2 terms, one short and one long, and whose decisions split his party so decisively that the consequences echo for generations. Rank 25. Sir Robert Peel, 5 years, 57 days. Peel's tenure comes in 2 parts, a brief early spell, then a longer period in the 1840s that ends with political self-destruction of a very particular sort, the kind that comes from choosing policy over party unity. Peel's longer premiership is defined by a reputation for administrative seriousness and reforming impulse. He is associated with modernising government, with the careful tightening of institutional screws. But the defining drama is economic and moral. The Corn Laws, and the decision to move toward repeal in the face of famine and mounting pressure. Longevity, in Peel's case, is earned through competence, yet the end shows the harshest reality of the job. Sometimes doing what you think is necessary makes you impossible for your own side to tolerate. His government collapses, and the Conservative Party fractures into factions that will take years to settle. Peel leaves office, and his 5-year total is sealed with the sense of a leader who understood the state but could not keep the party intact. And speaking of parties breaking, next comes a prime minister who serves 3 times, a man whose repeated returns show how Victorian politics could recycle leadership when the alternatives felt worse. Rank 26. The Earl of Derby, 3 years, 280 days. Derby's total is spread across 3 premierships, and the rhythm of those returns tells you something about mid-19th century politics. It can be unstable, opportunistic, and strangely forgiving of leaders who have already lost. His governments come and go like tide, forming, dissolving, reforming, often dependent on parliamentary numbers that shift under pressure. Longevity here isn't built from a single long reign. It's built from being the person your party can rally around when the moment demands a familiar face. Derby's time is wrapped around debates about reform, representation, and the constant question of how far the political nation should widen. His premierships also show the importance of being able to hand off power without completely collapsing the party, because in systems like this, you don't just govern, you maintain the apparatus that will try again next year. His final exit is due to illness, which is another low, recurring drumbeat in the story. The premiership is an endurance test, and sometimes the body simply ends the argument. Next, we come to a modern prime minister whose tenure is only slightly shorter, yet whose legacy feels carved into the social and economic conflicts of 1970s Britain. Rank 27. Edward Heath, 3 years, 259 days. Heath's time in office is not long, but it is dense, compressed with crisis, conflict, and the sense of a country trying to negotiate with itself and failing. His government faces industrial confrontation on a scale that makes the state feel fragile. Strikes, power shortages, and the political challenge of unions that have genuine leverage over daily life. Heath's longevity is limited partly because the country's problems refuse to sit quietly in the background. They walk into the living room, they turn off the lights, they ask you bluntly, who is in charge? Heath is also remembered for taking Britain into the European Economic Community, a decision that becomes a defining strand of later political life. In the long view, it's one of those acts that outlives the premiership that delivered it, proof that short tenures can still plant long-term consequences. He loses an election in 1974, and his years become a prelude to the political transformations that follow, the end of one consensus, the birth of another. And speaking of transformation, next is a prime minister whose tenure is associated with perhaps the most famous reform of the 19th century, and whose years show how a determined government can remake the system itself. Rank 28. The Earl Grey, 3 years, 229 days. Earl Grey's premiership is relatively short, yet it sits like a cornerstone because of the Reform Act era, when the structure of British politics begins to shift in a way that feels unmistakably modern. Grey's government comes in with the urgency of a pressure cooker. The The demand for reform is not polite background noise. It is loud, persistent, and sometimes threatening. The country has changed. Industrial towns swelling, old boroughs looking absurdly overrepresented, the legitimacy of the system under scrutiny. Longevity here comes from riding the wave of necessity. Gray's ministry becomes the vehicle for reform because the alternative looks like instability, possibly worse. And once that reform is achieved, the coalition of forces that held together to deliver it begins to strain. Gray resigns, and his time in office ends not with an election loss, but with the exhaustion of purpose and unity, one of the many ways prime ministers can leave without being directly voted out. And speaking of resignations, next comes a conservative prime minister whose tenure is longer than you might expect, and whose years are an example of how leadership can collapse slowly, like a roof you only notice when it finally falls. Rank 29. Arthur Balfour. 3 years, 145 days. Balfour's premiership sits in that Edwardian moment when the old order still feels confident, yet the ground beneath it is already shifting. His tenure is long enough to show how a government can be worn down by internal division and public dissatisfaction without a single dramatic catastrophe. The arguments over trade policy, particularly tariff reform, become the kind of issue that splits a party into competing faiths, and when a governing party is fighting itself, the opposition barely has to lift a finger. Balfour's leadership style is often described as intellectual, detached, almost languid. In some eras that reads as calm authority, in others it reads as indifference. Longevity depends not only on what you do, but on what people think you feel while doing it. He resigns in 1905, handing over to the Liberals and setting the stage for the great Liberal reforms that follow. And speaking of handovers, next is a Prime Minister whose tenure is made from 2 terms, one so brief it's almost a blink, the other longer, but shaped by illness and the demands of Napoleonic-era politics. Rank 30. The Duke of Portland. 3 years, 82 days. Portland's premiership is a study in how the office could be held by aristocratic figures whose personal leadership was sometimes less important than the coalition of forces around them. His first term is famously short, a political arrangement that doesn't settle. His second, from 1807 to 1809, lasts long enough to become meaningful, and yet it is marked by the reality that he is not well. The premiership, especially in wartime conditions, can be as much about the cabinet's collective direction as about the Prime Minister's personal energy, and Portland's later ministry reflects that dynamic. Longevity here is not the result of a single dominant personality. It's the result of a political structure trying to hold itself together during the long strain of war and national anxiety. Governments in such times can cling to continuity simply because the alternative looks dangerous. Portland resigns due to illness, and the pattern continues. The job has always been able to break people, even before the age of instant news and constant scrutiny. Next comes a Prime Minister whose tenure is slightly shorter but whose significance is immense, because he occupies the space between Pitt and the renewed wars, and reminds us that peace can be politically unstable too. The Earl of Rosebery, 1 year, 109 days. Rosebery's premiership has the peculiar feel of a story that begins mid-sentence and ends before you learn the main character's habits. He takes office in 1894, stepping into the space left by Gladstone, which is not an empty space at all. It's crowded with expectations, party tensions, and the constant Victorian pressure of empire, Ireland, and reform, all pulling in different directions at once. Rosebery is talented, aristocratic, and ambitious. But ambition alone doesn't keep a government together when your own party is fracturing into rival philosophies. His time is shaped by internal liberal division and by the strange truth that sometimes the Prime Minister is less a commander than a referee trying to keep ministers who dislike each other from turning cabinet into a battlefield. And when the referee's authority is questioned, the match stops making sense. He resigns in 1895, and the Liberals slide out of power. In the ranking of endurance, Rosebery's year and a bit is a reminder that the premiership can be short, not because the country rejects you directly, but because your own political ecosystem won't sustain you long enough to become fully real. And speaking of ecosystems, next comes an 18th century duke who resigns in frustration, showing how quickly a government can dissolve when it can't find a stable centre. The Duke of Grafton. 1 year, 106 days. Grafton's premiership sits in the late 1760s, when British politics is entangled with empire in a way that makes the domestic scene feel permanently unsettled. He becomes Prime Minister in 1768, in a period where factions and personalities jostle constantly, and where the question of authority, Parliament's authority, the Crown's influence, the Empire's cohesion, keeps returning like a headache that won't leave. Grafton's government is not a smooth, confident machine. It is a ministry under strain from the start, pressured by disputes over policy and by the instability of alliances that don't quite trust each other. Longevity, in his case, is limited by the exhausting reality of trying to govern without a reliable base. When support is conditional and shifting, every decision becomes a gamble. Every compromise becomes an invitation for someone to accuse you of weakness. He resigns in 1770 and the office passes to Lord North, who, as we saw much earlier, will last for more than a decade. That contrast is important. Sometimes the difference between a year and 12 years is not genius. It's whether the political ground beneath you holds still long enough to build on it. And speaking of building, our next entry is a short premiership that arrives during war, when the state is trying to keep itself upright while the world shakes it. Lord Grenville, 1 year, 42 days. Lord Grenville's premiership lands in the middle of the Napoleonic era, when the political atmosphere is thick with urgency and fear, and the government is expected to act as both shield and engine. He takes office in 1806 after Pitt the Younger's death, leading what's sometimes remembered as the Ministry of All the Talent, a title that sounds flattering, but also hints at coalition complexity. Coalitions can gather talent, yes. They can also gather competing priorities, competing egos, and competing visions of what the nation should be while war demands clarity. Grenville's government is associated with the attempt to address Catholic emancipation questions and broader reform impulses, but it collides with royal resistance and political opposition. And in a system where monarchy still holds real leverage, that resistance matters. A prime minister can be perfectly capable and still find that a key door simply will not open. He is replaced in 1807, and the job moves on to another set of hands. Grenville's short tenure is a reminder that the premiership is not only a contest of Parliament. In certain eras, it's also a negotiation with the Crown's boundaries, where a single unresolved conflict can cap your time in office like a hard ceiling. And speaking of hard ceilings, next comes a Prime Minister who resigns under public hostility so fierce it feels almost personal. The Earl of Bute, 317 days. Bute's premiership arrives in 1762, and it carries the scent of favouritism in the public imagination because he is closely associated with royal influence. And in an era suspicious of backstairs power, that association can be politically poisonous. He takes office as Britain is emerging from the 7 Years' War, a conflict that expands imperial reach but also expands debt, expectations and political argument. Peace is negotiated, and peace is never universally loved. There are always those who think it too generous, too timid, too costly, too quick. Bute becomes a target, mocked, attacked in print, and treated as an intruder in a political world that prides itself on aristocratic legitimacy while simultaneously loathing the wrong aristocrat. Longevity becomes impossible when the public mood turns into a kind of drumbeat against you, when it stops being about policy details and starts being about whether people can stand your existence in the role. He resigns in 1763, leaving behind a political aftertaste. A reminder that even in the 18th century, reputations could be manufactured and destroyed in a growing media culture, and that the Prime Minister's endurance depends partly on whether the country accepts the story told about them. And speaking of stories, Next comes the man who signs off on the end of one war and the beginning of another kind of political struggle, the painful, complicated birth of peace after American independence, the Earl of Shelburne. 266 days. Shelburne's premiership in 1782. 1783 is short, but it sits at a hinge point. Britain is negotiating the end of the American War of Independence, and the political class is trying to digest what it means to lose. He takes office after Rockingham's death, inheriting not only the office, but the fractured coalition that surrounds it. In this era, the Prime Minister's chair often feels less like a throne and more like a narrow perch. Sit wrong, and you slide off. Shelburne's government is closely tied to the peace process that recognizes American independence, a decision that is necessary but politically bitter because it forces Britain to admit limits. That admission stings. It also creates openings for rivals to accuse you of weakness or betrayal, even when you are handling the unavoidable. He is replaced in 1783, and what follows is one of those moments where Parliament rearranges itself through alliances that can look cynical from the outside, but practical from within. Shelburne's brief tenure is important in a ranking like this because it shows how the most consequential tasks, ending wars, redrawing the world, don't always belong to the longest-serving leaders. Sometimes they belong to the short tenure figures who happen to be holding the office when history demands a signature. And speaking of signatures, next comes a short premiership that looks almost like a clerical handover, yet reflects real instability in mid-18th century government. The Duke of Devonshire. 225 days. Devonshire's premiership in 1756. 1757 lasts only 225 days, and it occupies an awkward and turbulent moment when Britain is sliding into the wider conflict that becomes the 7 Years' War. He takes office in a political environment where ministries are fragile and factional. The structures of party are present but not yet hardened into the modern form, which means governments can be assembled and disassembled with unnerving speed. Devonshire's ministry is not remembered for sweeping reform or long-term stability. It's remembered as part of a churn, an attempt to manage a situation that is bigger than any single cabinet. Longevity here is limited by political mechanics. If you cannot secure durable parliamentary support, if the king's preferences shift, if rivals can assemble a stronger grouping, the premiership can end like a candle snuffed out rather than a door firmly shut. Devonshire is replaced, and the political world moves on toward more stable and longer wartime leadership. His short tenure sits close to the sub-year cluster we've already visited, and it serves as a quiet bridge, a reminder that even in the age of powdered wigs, the job could be brutally unstable, and the office could change hands quickly when the state was under stress. And now, with the remaining sub-year names already visited, Bonar Law, Goderic, Canning, and the famously brief modern record holder, we can finally step back from the ledger and ask what all these numbers are really showing us. Pattern. War makes tenure sticky until it doesn't. One of the strangest comforts in politics is crisis, not for the public, never for the public, but for leaders who know that emergencies can glue a government together. In wartime, prime ministers often last longer than the tone of normal politics would allow. The argument becomes changing leaders looks risky, and risk looks like defeat. You can hear it in the long runs of Pitt the Younger, Liverpool, and the wartime portion of Churchill's story. The job becomes less about winning the next internal skirmish, and more about projecting the idea that the state is still standing. But war has a second face. It can also destroy tenure faster than anything else. Once confidence cracks, Chamberlain's collapse in 1940 shows how quickly authority can drain when the public and Parliament decide that caution has become incapacity. Aberdeen's government buckles under the Crimean scandal storm. Eden's Suez crisis compresses his premiership into a single lasting wound. So war is sticky until it isn't. Crisis can hold you in place while you look like the best available option. The moment you look like the obstacle to survival, the glue turns to sand. And speaking of sand, Let's talk about what happens when the enemy isn't foreign, but sitting on your own benches. Pattern. Parties are the Prime Minister's real weather. Elections matter, yes, but the daily weather of a premiership is usually your own party. The public sees a leader and imagines a single will steering the ship. Inside Parliament, it's rarely that clean. Prime Ministers are supported, tolerated or threatened by colleagues who have their own ambitions, their own factions, their own red line. Thatcher lasts 11 years and then her party decides she is no longer useful. Major spends years trying to hold a party together that keeps breaking into arguments. May's tenure becomes a repeated test of arithmetic and loyalty. Johnson's collapse comes when internal support evaporates so quickly it feels like a floor giving way. Even the long-serving figures of earlier centuries survived by managing coalitions of elite obedience. Walpole's genius is not simply policy, it's parliamentary management. Salisbury's durability is built on timing and party control. Gladstone's repeated returns reflect not only popularity, but the party's need for him at certain moments. If you want a single sentence to carry into the rest of the documentary, let it be this: the Prime Minister is rarely removed by opponents. They are usually removed when their own side stops believing that keeping them is safer than replacing them. And speaking of safety, there is one more pattern that runs quietly through this entire ranking, like a slow breath underneath the politics. Pattern, the body, keeps its own calendar. In the neat arithmetic of tenure, illness looks like a footnote. In real life, it is often the main event. So many long and medium tenures end not in defeat, but in resignation due to illness. Liverpool, Macmillan, Churchill's second premiership, Bonar Law's heartbreakingly brief time. Even in earlier centuries, you can feel how physical limitation shapes political possibility. Chatham's government drifts because the Prime Minister is absent in health. Portland's later tenure is defined by fragility. Percival's life is ended by assassination. Violent, sudden, final. The office demands stamina, and stamina is a resource people don't like to discuss openly because it feels impolite, or because it feels like weakness. But prime ministers are not carved from marble. They are people with bodies that tire, hearts that fail, nerves that fray, and illnesses that don't care about parliamentary calendars. This is part of why the longest-serving list is never just a list of political talent. It's also a list of human endurance, of who could keep waking up, opening the red boxes, and carrying the weight for one more day. And now, we're close enough to the end of our ledger that we can begin gathering the threads, because a ranking isn't only about who lasted, it's about what lasting really costs. Pattern. Long tenure doesn't always mean good times. It's tempting, especially in a world that loves simple stories, to treat longevity as proof of success. 20 years? You must have been brilliant. 11 years? You must have been adored. 10 years? You must have been right. But the list refuses that comfort. Lord North lasts more than 12 years and presides over the loss of the American colonies. Liverpool lasts more than 14 years in an era associated with repression and social tension. Long tenure can mean you are navigating prosperity, but it can also mean the political system is stuck, unwilling to change leadership even as problems deepen. Sometimes stability isn't a sign that things are going well. Sometimes it's a sign that the people in power have built strong ways to stay in power. And even when a long tenure contains genuine achievements, the length itself can magnify damage. The longer a leader governs, the more their choices become the weather everyone lives under. If the weather is harsh, people don't just suffer once, they suffer repeatedly, season after season, until hardship begins to feel normal. This is why the ranking is such an effective lens for sleep history storytelling. It turns politics into an endurance narrative, and endurance narratives always reveal the quiet cost. Who had to compromise? Who had to accept cruelty as order? Who had to live under policies that no longer felt temporary? Longevity can be earned. Longevity can also be imposed. And speaking of imposed, let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum, where tenures are so short they feel like glitches in the record. Pattern. Very short tenures are often symptoms, not causes. When a prime minister lasts a year, a few months, or famously weeks, it's natural to blame the person. Sometimes that's fair. Sometimes it's not. Short tenures often happen when a political system is already sick. A party has been in power too long and has rotted from inside. A coalition has collapsed, but no new structure is ready. An economic crisis is brewing, and the leader inherits it at the exact moment it becomes visible. A referendum has cracked the country's assumptions. A scandal has eaten the public's patience. Or in older centuries, court influence and factional deals create ministries that exist only on paper. In that sense, a short tenure can be more like a thermometer reading than an engine failure. It doesn't cause the fever, it reveals it. Truss's 49 days become a symbol of market panic and political overreach, yes, but also of a party that had already spent years tearing through leadership and credibility. Sunak's short tenure ends in electoral defeat, but the defeat belongs not only to him, it belongs to the accumulated fatigue of 14 years of government. Even the rapid churn Victorian and Hanoverian ministries reflect systems where the foundations are unstable. The brief tenure isn't the storm, it's the sign that the roof was already loose. And speaking of roofs, let's take one last quiet tour through the whole ranking, not by name, but by what it teaches us about the job itself. What this ranking reveals about the job. The prime ministership is often described like a throne, but it behaves like a rope bridge. It sways with parliament. It creaks under public mood. It frays when your party argues. It snaps when crisis arrives and your grip isn't trusted. The longest-serving leaders aren't always the most glamorous. Often they are the best at managing people rather than impressing crowds. Walpole survives because he masters patronage and parliament. Salisbury survives because he times his exits and returns. Blair survives because he keeps winning elections and controlling narrative. Liverpool survives because his government holds steady through strain. The legends, meanwhile, don't always last. Churchill's myth is immense, but his total time, though large, is not top 10. His greatness is concentrated, not extended. And that's another gentle truth. Sometimes the most important leadership happens in a compressed period. History remembers intensity as much as length. Meanwhile, many of the prime ministers who fall quickly aren't weak in character. They are simply out of sync with their moment, or trapped in a moment too broken to be managed by any one person. And then there is the personal cost. We've seen it over and over. Resignation due to illness, collapse under stress, exhaustion disguised as dignity. The job demands not only political skill, but daily stamina, and it punishes the body as readily as it punishes the reputation. So when we say, how long did they last, we are really asking, who could endure the system, and what kind of system were they enduring? Now, with the ledger complete enough to feel whole, let's close in the same slow tone we began, by stepping away from the numbers and listening for the human sound inside them. If you let the days stack up, 20 years at the top, 10 years at the top, a year at the top, 49 days at the top, you start to hear a strange rhythm in British history, like a clock you didn't realise was ticking. Some prime ministers last because crisis makes the country cling to continuity. Some last because they understand Parliament the way a gardener understands soil, what needs feeding, what needs cutting back, what will grow if you leave it alone. Some last because their opponents are divided, or because their party, for a time, decides that loyalty is safer than ambition. And some don't last at all, not really. Not because they weren't clever or determined, but because they stepped into office at the exact moment the floorboards gave way. Their short tenures become symbols, little warnings pinned to the timeline. Beware a party that's been in power too long. Beware a policy gamble that can't be reversed. Beware the illusion that speed is the same as control. If there's comfort in this ranking, sleepy, quiet comfort, it's the reminder that the office is never truly solid. The black door of number 10 looks permanent, but the people behind it are temporary. They arrive with plans, and they leave with consequences. Some leave by choice, some by defeat, some by betrayal, some by illness, and one, shockingly, by assassination in the very building where politics is meant to be civil. And yet the pattern continues decade after decade. A new name, a new term, a new set of days added to the ledger. So when you drift off tonight, let the numbers become something softer than trivia. Let them become a story about endurance, about how power is held, how it slips, how it breaks people, and how, in the end, even the longest-serving Prime Minister is only a chapter. And if you want more slow British history like this, long, detail-rich, and built for sleep or background listening, tap like, subscribe, and I'll meet you again somewhere down the timeline, where another door opens and another clock begins.